Hello, and welcome to Politics for the People. I'm your host, Michael Striano. Thanks for listening and joining in the conversation. You can find links to our Patreon and Instagram in the show notes and sign up for our weekly newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts to help others find the show. Okay, let's get to it. On today's episode, we take a look at redistricting. What is it? Why and when does it happen? Who actually does it? And how does it affect us? First, let's start, as always, with the definition. Redistricting is the redrawing of district borders, deciding who is represented by what district. A quick note, there are separate systems for state and congressional districts, and today we're going to be talking about congressional redistricting. If you'd like to revisit the topic later and discuss state redistricting, let us know on our Patreon page, linked in the show notes, or Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast. So, what is redistricting? Redistricting has been a topic of discussion for people in politics since our country was born, but was really pushed to the forefront of the conversation after the 2016 election. As Americans took a closer look at the election results, after the presidential winner lost the popular vote for the second time in 5 elections, they noticed the House of Representatives was surprisingly red in an election that featured 3 million more blue votes. The House is meant to be representative of the people, so it stands to reason that if one party won a significant majority of the popular vote, there should be corresponding results in the makeup of the House of Representatives. To figure out how this is possible, we have to jump back a bit to 2010. Every 10 years, as we know very well in 2020, the census is taken, and we get what is hopefully a more accurate view of the population of our country. Our episode last week was about the census, so definitely check it out if you missed it. But simply put, the census tells us who lives where. Based on this information, the Constitution says that congressional districts have to be redrawn to ensure appropriate representation of the people, but leaves the process up to the individual states. It's actually a little funny to go back and read the Constitution, because it says the ratio of citizens to representatives shall not exceed 30,000 to 1. Clearly, the kind of population growth our country has seen was inconceivable in 1787. Today, House members represent about 754,000 people on average. Looking back through history, you don't have to look very hard to see how the redistricting process was abused to disenfranchise citizens, taking away the power of their vote and their voice in our government and elections. During the redistricting process of 1991, Texas Democrats created a district spanning hundreds of miles and containing slivers of former districts, siphoning off reliable Republican voters and consolidating them into just a few districts. In the election that followed, people voted for Republicans and Democrats at roughly the same rate, but Democrats walked away with 70% of the state's congressional seats. A decade later, in 2000, we saw a state senator who quickly threw together a hasty campaign in an attempt to unseat a very established, well-connected incumbent, still get a remarkable 30% of the vote. If the challenge were to be repeated with 2 years of planning and organizing, it would be competitive to say the least. In that year's redistricting campaign, the exact block where the state senator lived was carved out of the district, making him ineligible to repeat his challenge. 8 years later, that state senator made history by becoming our first black president. Similar stories extend back through our history to the late 1700s in what is known as gerrymandering. We'll have an entire episode devoted to gerrymandering coming up soon, so subscribe now so you don't miss it. So now, let's look at how redistricting happens. Using the census data, states create the most appropriate districts possible to represent the population. Since the different states were left to develop their own means of achieving this goal, a few different systems have emerged, the most common being legislatively. The state legislatures convene and draw the maps themselves, then vote on the maps as if they were regular pieces of legislation. Laws, which are then sent to the governor to be signed or vetoed. In the event that a governor vetoes a map, or if a legislative deadline is not met, some states utilize a backup commission. How these commissions are comprised varies by state, with some giving the power to the governor or secretary of state, while others look to the state's legislative leaders. Of the 31 states whose legislatures draw their maps, only 4, Florida, Maryland, Mississippi, and North Carolina, do not require the governor's approval, which also means the governor has no veto power over the congressional maps. A problem with this system, as we saw in the earlier Texas example, is when legislators themselves are drawing the maps, they'll probably be biased. Next, let's look at the advisory commission system, practiced by New York, Connecticut, Iowa, and Utah. A commission is assembled of legislators, lawmakers, and some members who are neither. While these commissions do spend the most time working on the maps, and their recommendations are often listened to, they do not have final say over the maps. The commission draws their idea of what's fair, then the state legislature decides in an up or down vote whether to accept the recommendations. Although it is a slightly different system, the inherent problems here mirror those of the legislative system. Namely, the legislators are still the ones in the room making the decisions. In a similar style, but trying to keep actual legislators out of the room, the states of New Jersey, Washington, Idaho, and Hawaii have their maps drawn by political appointees. The members are selected by the state's legislators themselves or their political parties and party leadership. Representation within the committee depends on the state, with some ensuring equal say and others allowing one party a majority in the conversation. Now, sure, the legislators themselves are out of the room, but only because they or their party get to handpick who goes in. The same potential for corruption in the other systems still exists. While no system can be perfect, because nothing is, they all have some obvious flaws when it comes to partisanship and the potential for corruption. In an effort to limit corruption in redistricting, 4 states have developed and adopted an independent commission model: Colorado, Arizona, Michigan, and California. Here, an independent entity screens candidates and appoints a group composed of neither legislators nor lawmakers. The commission draws and votes on the congressional district map for their state, completely removing the state legislature and the governor's office from the conversation. In fact, regulations exist explicitly limiting the engagement or participation of elected officials in the process and banning commissioners from running for office in the districts they draw. Additional bans prohibit commissioners being linked in any way to the state legislature, such as working as staffers or lobbyists. Of the 50 states in our union, 7 have low enough populations to only qualify for 1 congressional district: Alaska, Vermont, Delaware, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and Wyoming. So how does this whole process affect Americans? And why should we care? Well, there isn't really a quick and easily digestible soundbite answer when it comes to redistricting, which is probably why you don't know more about it or hear about it much on the news. Simply put, it's not sexy. But it is vitally important to our form of government. We Americans like to tout our democracy and love the word like we love our flag. But the honest truth is, we live in a democratic republic. I know that may sound like I'm arguing semantics, but bear with me for a minute, because the difference is absolutely vital to the functioning of our government. We don't all have a voice and a say in governmental operations. Instead, we elect representatives to convene in a Congress and make those decisions for us. We have as much or as little input as those representatives choose to give us, but the choices are ultimately theirs. If we disagree with our representatives, we are free to vote for someone else in the next election. But the fact that we give our collective voice to those representatives is a foundational and critical structural difference between a true democracy and a democratic republic. Getting back to the initial question of why we should all care about redistricting. Because it determines our voice in government. You could say it determines the power we as individuals have in our democracy. There are a lot of pieces that go into this conversation, but our voice in Washington ultimately comes down to the redistricting process, something we have unfortunately little say in. If you want more input on the process, check out what your state's process is. Do you have state houses pass legislation, or is there a committee system? If your state legislators have input, do you even know who your state representatives are? It's very easy to find out, and I encourage you to look them up and check out their voting records. It's easy for politicians to say the right things, but when push comes to shove, where do they stand? Thanks for listening, and a special thanks to our patrons on Patreon for your help in making this happen, and all those who have left us a review. Be sure to check out the show notes, where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and follow us on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast. Want to help shape the conversation, have a say in episode topics, and get exclusive content, including early access to episodes and live conversations with me? Check the show notes, head on over to our Patreon page, and subscribe for as little as $3. We'll see you Wednesday with our newsletter, and Friday with a brand new episode. Take care.